The scream never came. It was swallowed by the silence, clipped short in the back of Eric's throat, as if something had reached into his chest and stolen the sound before it could escape. His camera was still streaming live to a few dozen friends across the country, all of them watching as he froze in place, pupils blown wide, staring into the corner of his dorm room where no one else should have been. For a split second, some swore they saw the faint outline of a figure in the grainy pixelated background, tall, dark, and utterly faceless beneath the brim of a shadowed hat. Then Eric slumped forward, his forehead striking the edge of his desk with a hollow thud. His headset slipped sideways, the mic catching the rustle of his shallow breath before silence flooded the feed. When campus security broke into his locked room an hour later, they found him sitting upright in the chair, body still warm, lips parted as if mid-word, but his eyes were wide open, emptied of everything that had once been Eric. Daniel Tran couldn't get the image out of his head. He hadn't even been watching the live stream when it happened, only the recordings that surfaced afterward, circulating like wildfire through Reddit threads, Discord servers, and late-night YouTube compilations. The video kept being taken down, flagged for graphic or disturbing content. But it always resurfaced under a new title, mirrored, reversed, slowed down frame by people desperate to see what the camera might have caught. And every time Daniel forced himself to watch it, he saw the same thing. Not just his friend collapsing, not just the uncanny stillness of the body afterward. No, saw the shadow in the corner, the suggestion of a man too tall, too thin, his presence sucking the oxygen right out of the room. Daniel had known Eric since freshman orientation. He knew the guy's laugh, knew his nervous habit of tapping a pencil against his teeth when he studied, knew that he never believed in ghosts or curses or anything that couldn't be measured in data or logic. But that look in Eric's eyes during the final seconds of his life, that raw, paralyzing terror wasn't fake. And the silence afterward, the unnatural stillness. It was as though something had been taken. The university tried to spin the tragedy as sudden cardiac arrest. Students whispered about stress, Adderall, undiagnosed conditions. But Daniel sat through the memorial. The kind words from professors, the shallow condolences from administrators, and all he could think was, they didn't see his eyes. Late that night, unable to sleep, Daniel pulled the covers tighter around himself in the small dorm he shared with a roommate who was rarely around. The video replayed in his mind like a curse. That moment 2 seconds before Eric collapsed, when his lips had moved, forming a single word. Daniel had watched it enough times to know what Eric had been trying to say. Run. It started small, a shadow moving where none should have been, just at the edge of Daniel's peripheral vision. The feeling of being watched when he walked home from late lectures, every hair on his arms rising, breath catching in his chest. His reflection in the darkened window seemed delayed, as if it were considering whether or not to move at all. He told himself it was grief, stress, his brain playing tricks on him. But then came the dreams. Always the same. He was standing in an endless hallway lined with locked doors, each one humming faintly, vibrating like it contained something desperate to escape. At the far end stood a figure in a wide-brimmed hat, motionless, faceless, its outline rippling like heat on asphalt. The more Daniel tried to run, the further the figure seemed to stretch the hallway, each step dragging him deeper instead of closer to the exit. And then the voice, low, hollow, the echo of something ancient. You've been marked. Daniel always woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, his throat raw as if he had been screaming in his sleep. 2 weeks after Eric's death, another student collapsed. A girl from Daniel's psychology seminar, found slumped over her textbook in the library. Same look in the eyes, same eerie stillness. By then, whispers had spread through campus. Students joked nervously about the collector, a campus ghost story reborn from the tragedy. But Daniel wasn't laughing. He started noticing the pattern. Every victim had mentioned strange sights, shadows, or nightmares in the days before their death. And now Daniel's nightmares were growing worse. One stormy evening, he found himself back in the library. He told himself he was studying for midterms, but his laptop lay forgotten as he sifted through the archives, pulling microfilms and dusty clippings from decades past. That was when he found it, an article yellowed with age, dated 1954. The headline, 4 students found lifeless in Willow Creek College dorms. The description was chillingly familiar. Each victim had been discovered seated upright. No signs of struggle. Eyes wide open. Bodies still warm. Doctors had called it a mystery epidemic. The article quoted a single surviving roommate who claimed the last thing one victim said before dying was, "He's here." Daniel's blood ran cold. Willow Creek College was the old name for the very campus he lived on. And the article mentioned something else an urban legend whispered even then. They called him the soul collector. That night, Daniel sat alone in his dorm room, laptop casting a pale glow across his face. He felt the weight of inevitability. Eric had been the first. Others were following. And now Daniel could feel the mark on him too. A hollow tug at the center of his chest. Like something was already reaching through, loosening his soul thread by thread. He thought about calling his parents back home, telling them everything. But what could he say? That a faceless man in a hat was hunting him. That his dreams weren't dreams at all, but warnings. They would tell him to get counseling, to rest. Instead, Daniel opened a blank document and began typing. He wrote everything: Eric's death, the shadows, the voice in his dreams, the article from 1954. He wrote because some part of him knew that if he stopped, if he let silence reclaim the room, he would hear footsteps approaching his door. 3:30. His vision blurred with exhaustion. He saved the file, shut the laptop, and turned toward his bed. That was when he saw it. The brim of a hat, just visible in the corner of the room. Daniel's scream tore the silence this time. But no one came. Daniel's scream echoed against the thin drywall of his dorm room, rattling the blinds and startling the silence into life. For one raw instant he was certain someone, his roommate, a neighbor, anyone, would burst through the door, flip on the lights, and banish whatever horror lurked in the shadows. But the hallway outside stayed quiet. No footsteps, no voices, just the hum of the radiator and the faint whistle of wind sneaking through the window frame. He forced himself to blink, breath ragged, throat tight with panic. The corner was empty. No hat, no figure, no impossible shadow bending reality at its edges. Only his pile of laundry stacked on the chair, the fabric shifting slightly in the draft from the window. Daniel pressed both palms against his face, dragging in air until the spinning slowed. Just grief, just exhaustion. He hadn't been sleeping, barely eating. Stress played tricks. He almost convinced himself. Almost. Then came the knock. 3 slow raps against the dorm door. Deliberate, spaced apart. Daniel froze. His heart banged so hard he thought the sound alone would answer whatever stood outside. Another knock. Louder this time. "Eric." A voice rasped, thin as wind through leaves. Daniel's stomach dropped. He stumbled backward until his calves hit the edge of his bed. No one had spoken that name aloud in his room since the memorial. No one dared. The knob twitched. Adrenaline surged. He grabbed the nearest object-a-metal desk lamp and clutched it like a weapon. "Who's there?" His voice cracked in the middle. Silence. Then the faint scuff of footsteps retreating down the hallway. Daniel stood motionless for long minutes, every nerve screaming. Finally, he forced himself forward, pressed an eye to the peephole. The corridor stretched empty, lit only by the dim fluorescent glow at the far end. No one. And yet he knew in the marrow of his bones that the visitor hadn't been human. The next morning, Daniel walked across campus in a daze. Leaves skittered along the pavement, brittle underfoot. Students hurried between classes, faces buried in phones, oblivious to the dread that coiled tighter around him with every passing hour. He needed answers. The article from 1954 wasn't enough. The library's basement archives smelled of mold and dust. Rows of cabinets filled with yellow documents few students ever touched. The old librarian raised an eyebrow when Daniel asked about urban legends. But she shuffled off without comment and returned with a worn leather binder. "Local folklore," she muttered, sliding it across the counter. "You'll find plenty of ghost stories in there. Just don't stay down too long." The binder creaked as Daniel opened it, brittle pages threatening to crumble under his fingers. Midway through, he found it, The Collector. The story was older than the campus itself, traced back to whispered tales from the early settlers of Willow Creek. A man who made a bargain in the woods, who gave up his face and his name in exchange for immortality. In return, he would walk the earth forever, harvesting souls to feed the darkness that granted him life. Every generation, the legend said, he returned to the town. Students disappeared. Their vitality leached away. Their bodies left as shells. Survivors described the same image, a faceless man in a hat, standing just beyond the light. Daniel shut the binder, pulse hammering. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just campus superstition. Something was stalking them, just as it had 70 years ago. And now, Daniel thought, it's after me. That night he tried to stay awake. He brewed coffee until his stomach churned, paced the room until his legs ached. His roommate still hadn't returned from his girlfriend's apartment. Another stroke of luck. Or perhaps fate ensuring Daniel faced the nightmare alone. Sometime after 4, his eyelids betrayed him. He woke with a start, head slumped against the desk, screensaver pulsing across his laptop. The air was heavy, thick as syrup. And then he realized he wasn't in his dorm anymore. He stood once more in the endless hallway from his dreams. Doors lined both sides, rattling faintly as if fists pounded from within. The floorboards stretched into shadow without end. And at the far distance, closer than ever before, stood the Collector. Hat brim low, face erased, body elongated like a smear on film. This time, Daniel couldn't run. His feet rooted to the warped floor, breath tearing shallow in his chest. The Collector lifted one hand, fingers long, jointed wrong, curling in a beckoning motion. Yours. The voice boomed inside Daniel's skull. Is mine. The doors lining the hallway shuddered violently. From the cracks spilled slivers of light, each one glowing faintly before being sucked toward the collector's chest like moths to a flame. Inside those doors, Daniel glimpsed faces distorted, pale, mouths stretched in silent screams. Souls. He was standing inside the prison where they were kept. Eric's face pressed against the nearest door window, eyes hollow, lips mouthing words Daniel couldn't hear. No. Daniel gasped, shoving against the locked door, wood splintering beneath his palms. No. I won't let you. The collector's silhouette expanded, swallowing the light, his faceless head tilting with amusement. The hallway bent, walls curving inward, and Daniel felt himself dragged toward the void at its center. His body lifted from the ground, pulled by invisible hooks in his chest. He clawed at the air, throat tearing with a scream that no one would hear. Daniel woke on the floor of his dorm, sweat soaking his shirt. The clock read 6 a.m. Dawn glowed faintly at the window, but the chill in the room lingered. And on his desk, where he had left nothing, sat a single object. A glass jar. Empty. Waiting. The jar stayed there all day. Daniel stuffed it into his backpack, tossed it into the dumpster, even left it on the steps of the chapel. Each time, he returned to his room only to find it waiting on the desk again, gleaming faintly as though it mocked him. By the third day, cracks had begun to show in his sanity. He caught himself staring at classmates, imagining what their souls might look like bottled inside glass. He startled awake in lectures, sure he'd felt cold fingers brush the back of his neck. It was driving him mad, and yet it wasn't madness. It was possession. The collector was claiming him piece by piece, eroding his will until there'd be nothing left but an empty body with hollow eyes. Unless he found a way to fight back. Daniel returned to the library, binder in hand, and demanded access to the restricted stacks. The librarian hesitated until Daniel's wild eyes convinced her not to argue. Down in the archives, he uncovered scraps of testimony from 1954 priests, students, police. One account stood out. A survivor named Michael Rowan claimed he broke free of the collector's grasp by confronting it in the old chapel, reciting prayers until dawn drove the figure back. But Rowan vanished weeks later, and no trace of him was found. The chapel, the same decrepit building where Daniel had left the jar. That evening, as rain slicked the cobblestones and thunder rattled the campus, Daniel carried the jar beneath his jacket and made his way to the chapel. The building loomed at the far edge of campus, abandoned decades earlier, its steeple crooked, stained glass windows fractured. The heavy oak doors resisted before groaning open, releasing a breath of dust and rot. Inside, pews lay scattered, altar cloths moth-eaten, crucifix sagging on rusted nails. The air felt thick, charged, as though the walls remembered centuries of prayer but had long since been abandoned by faith. Daniel placed the jar on the altar. His hands trembled. "If you want me," he whispered into the darkness, "come take me here." The silence thickened. Shadows lengthened. And then the collector was there. No footsteps. No warning. One moment the chapel was empty. The next, the space bent around his towering form, his hat brim grazing the vaulted ceiling. The crucifix groaned on its nails. Daniel's knees threatened to buckle, but he forced himself upright. You can't have me. He choked. You can't have anyone else. The collector tilted his faceless head. His voice boomed inside Daniel's mind. Your soul is already promised. The jar rattled violently on the altar, light sparking inside it. Faint at first, then growing brighter. Daniel realized with horror it wasn't empty anymore. It was filling with him. No. He lunged, grabbing the jar, clutching it to his chest. Heat seared his palms, but he held on. You can't take me. The collector extended his hand, fingers splaying, and the jar vibrated so violently Daniel thought it would shatter. The light inside flared, blinding, and then Daniel remembered the article. Michael Rowan. Prayers until dawn. But Daniel hadn't prayed in years. Still, he forced the words out. Clumsy. Desperate. Our Father, who art in heaven. His voice cracked. He tightened his grip on the jar. Words tumbling faster. Hallowed be thy name. The collector's form rippled, edges distorting. The voice in Daniel's skull screamed, low and furious, a storm of rage. The jar pulsed with light, brighter, brighter, until Daniel could barely see. Deliver us from evil. He shouted, tears streaking his face. And in that instant, thunder cracked, lightning split the sky, and dawn's first light pierced through the broken stained glass window, cutting across the altar. The collector recoiled, his outline unraveling like smoke, retreating toward the shadows. The jar slipped from Daniel's hands, shattering against the stone floor, and from its fragments spilled a burst of light faces, voices, fragments of laughter and screams. Souls, freed at last, rising in a torrent toward the heavens. Among them, Daniel glimpsed Eric. His friend's eyes met his, no longer hollow, filled instead with gratitude. Then the vision dissolved, leaving Daniel alone in the ruined chapel, shards of glass glinting at his feet. But the air still hummed, a warning. The collector wasn't gone. Not yet. Daniel's body trembled as he leaned against the altar, chest heaving, palms still scorched from gripping the jar. The chapel was quiet again, save for the whisper of rain through shattered windows and the faint moan of the wind weaving through cracks in the stone. But the silence wasn't peace. It was waiting. The souls had escaped. Yes, but the collector had not been destroyed. Daniel could still feel him, like static in the air, lingering beyond sight, biding his time. For a long moment, Daniel stared at the shards scattered across the floor. Each fragment glowed faintly, fading slowly as the freed spirits vanished. He crouched, picked one up. It was cool now, harmless, only glass. Eric's face flashed again in his mind. Gratitude, fleeting, then gone forever. Daniel let the shard slip from his fingers. The days after the chapel incident blurred together. Daniel barely spoke in class. He avoided crowded cafeterias, lived on vending machine snacks. Every time he closed his eyes, he half expected to wake back in that endless hallway. Doors rattling with trapped souls. The collector waiting at the far end. But the dreams didn't return. Not immediately. Instead, reality began to fray. Objects moved in his dorm. A textbook shifted from shelf to desk without his touch. His mirror cracked down the center overnight. The jar, though destroyed, seemed reborn in different forms, an empty bottle by his bed. A coffee mug he swore had been full seconds earlier. Always hollow. Always waiting. By the third night, Daniel knew the collector wasn't gone. He was simply tightening the noose, testing Daniel's resolve, reminding him that no prayer could banish what had been promised. The breaking point came in the library. Daniel had been searching for anything rituals, folklore, survivor accounts. He'd even ventured into online forums, dark corners where anonymous posters swapped ghost stories like currency. None of it helped. Then he saw her. A girl seated 2 tables away, her face pale, lips parted in shallow breaths. At first he thought she was sleeping, head propped in her hand. But then her shoulders jerked. Once, twice, like a marionette with tangled strings. Her eyes opened. Daniel dropped his book. They were hollow. The same glassy emptiness he had seen in Eric. No, he whispered, stumbling to his feet. Not again. The girl's body slumped forward onto her notebook. A ripple of gasps spread through nearby students. Someone shouted for help. But Daniel already knew she was gone. The collector had claimed another. That night, Daniel packed a backpack with essentials water, protein bars, flashlight, his grandfather's old rosary. He couldn't wait for the next victim. Couldn't wait for the collector to tighten his grip around the entire campus. He had to end it. The chapel hadn't worked. Dawn and prayer had weakened the collector. Yes, but not destroyed him. If anything, the attempt had enraged him. The binder in the library hinted at something older than prayer, older than churches. A note scribbled in the margin. The bargain was made in the woods. That was where Daniel needed to go. Willow Creek Forest stretched beyond the edge of town, dense with pines that whispered even when the air was still. Students rarely ventured past the first trails, citing wild animals and poison ivy. But Daniel knew better. The fear in their voices when they spoke of the woods was older, deeper. Midnight. He stood at the tree-line, breath fogging in the chill. The flashlight beam carved a narrow path ahead, but shadows swallowed it almost instantly. He stepped forward. The woods closed in around him, branches knitting overhead, muffling the sounds of civilization until only his heartbeat remained. Minutes bled into an hour. The path wound deeper, roots snaring his ankles, brambles clawing at his arms. He nearly turned back when he saw it, a clearing lit by pale moonlight. At its center stood a stone altar, cracked and moss-eaten, yet unmistakably human-made. Symbols carved into its surface writhed as though alive, lines twisting under his gaze. And above the altar, waiting, was the collector. This time, he did not appear as a fleeting shadow. He was solid, immense, every inch of him wrong. His hat brim obscured where a face should be, but beneath it lay only void, darker than the night. His hands dangled at his sides, too long, fingers brushing the ground like claws. You return. The voice boomed, vibrating through Daniel's chest. As was promised. Daniel forced himself to stand tall, though his knees shook. I didn't make a bargain with you. You are heir to it, the collector hissed. Your bloodline touched mine long ago. Your soul was marked before you were born. Daniel's breath caught. What are you talking about? The void beneath the hat rippled, and images surged through Daniel's mind. A man kneeling at this very altar generations ago, face twisted with desperation. A deal struck in whispers, offering lineage for survival. A curse passed down like inheritance. Daniel staggered. His family. His blood. No, he whispered, shaking his head. That's not possible. It is truth. The collector said. Your soul is mine by right. Daniel fell to his knees, clutching the rosary. Then take me. Leave the others. End this cycle. The collector tilted his faceless head, considering. Brave. Foolish. But it does not end. It never ends. For each bargain, there must always be a keeper. If you fall, another will rise. The chain cannot break. Then I'll break it myself. Daniel spat. He lunged at the altar, slamming the rosary onto its surface, shouting words that felt torn from his lungs. In the name of every soul you've stolen, be bound no more. Light flared. The woods shook with a roar, trees bending as if in a hurricane. The collector shrieked, his form unraveling, shadow limbs flailing against invisible bonds. The symbols on the altar ignited, burning white-hot. For a moment, Daniel believed he had won. But then the light reversed, sucked inward, funneled into the void beneath the hat. The collector straightened, steadied, grew taller, stronger. You cannot bind what was born from the binding. He thundered. Your defiance feeds me. Daniel stumbled back, horror clawing his chest. His attempt hadn't weakened the collector, it had empowered him. The forest went silent. And then the doors appeared. They rose around the clearing, countless and impossible. Freestanding portals identical to those from Daniel's dreams. Each one rattled, glowed, hummed with imprisoned light. The souls. Eric's face again, pale behind one door. The girl from the library behind another. More and more. A legion of the lost. Their hollow eyes fixed on Daniel. The collector spread his arms. Behold my collection. And know it will never end. Daniel's tears blurred his vision. Rage boiled beneath his fear. Then I'll set them free even if it kills me. He rushed to the nearest door, slamming his fists against it. The wood cracked but held. A pale hand pressed back from the other side. Eric's lips shaping his name. Help me. The whisper carried. Faint but real. Daniel screamed. Drove the rosary into the crack. The beads glowed, heat searing his skin. And with a final shatter, the door burst open. Light exploded outward. Eric's soul surged free, rushing past Daniel in a stream of radiance. The collector howled. Daniel staggered, chest burning. But he forced himself to the next door. One by one, he smashed them open. Light burst. Souls screamed in release. The clearing ablaze with brilliance. The collector thrashed, shadows lashing like whips. But Daniel pressed on, each door weakening the monster. Each freed soul a wound carved into his dominion. But with each release, Daniel felt himself dimming. His vision tunneled. His breath shortened. Every soul freed demanded a piece of his own. By the 10th door, his knees buckled. By the 12th, blood dripped from his nose. Still, he rose again. Because in the chaos, he understood. This was the only way to end the cycle. To free them all, he would have to give himself completely. Daniel turned toward the collector, who staggered now, form unraveling with every soul lost. Take me, Daniel shouted, voice raw. But take me last. Let them go first. The collector's void face tilted, a grotesque parody of a smile. Gladly. Daniel slammed the rosary into the altar one final time, shouting with every ounce of breath, "Be free." The clearing erupted. Every door shattered at once. A storm of souls rushing upward. Blinding light ripping through the canopy. Voices filled the night, laughter. Sobs. Cries of release. And then silence. All but one. Daniel felt the hooks sink into his chest. The collector's hand closed around his soul. Pulling. Tearing. He fell. Vision darkening. Body collapsing beside the shattered altar. The last thing he saw was Eric's face among the freed, smiling as he vanished into the light. And then the world went black. Darkness. Daniel drifted in it. Weightless. Endless. Without thought or body. For a moment, just a fragile sliver of time, he felt peace. No screaming souls. No echoing footsteps. No looming shadow in a wide-brimmed hat. Just silence. But peace was never meant for him. A whisper slithered through the void. You offered yourself. You are mine. Pain lanced through him, tearing what remained of his soul into ribbons. He tried to scream but had no voice. Tried to resist but had no form. The collector pulled him inward, dragged him into the same prison where thousands before had rotted in silence. Except there was no prison left. The doors were gone. The chains broken. The souls had flown. The cage stood empty. And the collector, weakened by loss, clutched at Daniel as his final anchor. Daniel felt the shadow trying to bind him, to rebuild the prison with his essence as foundation. His mind split between terror and clarity. This was the choice he had made, to end the cycle by sacrificing himself. But sacrifice was not the same as surrender. Daniel opened his eyes. He lay on the forest floor, chest heaving, body broken but alive. The altar was cracked straight down the center, glowing faintly as if some inner fire still smoldered. The rosary lay beside him, beads scattered like spilled blood. The collector hovered above him, half-formed, unraveling. Where once he had towered, vast and unshakable, now he shivered in tatters of shadow. His voice rasped like dry leaves. You freed them, but you remain. You are mine. Daniel forced himself to sit, though every bone screamed. He lifted the last intact bead of the rosary, its tiny cross reflecting moonlight. His hand shook violently, but he held it steady. Not yours, Daniel whispered. Not anymore. The collector hissed, a sound of rage and desperation combined. His claw-like hand darted forward, sinking into Daniel's chest. Cold fire spread through him, hollowing him out. Daniel gasped, vision fracturing. In that instant he understood he could not resist the pull. The collector would take him. His soul would burn. Unless he turned inward, into the memory of Eric's face, into the faces of every soul he had freed, into the warmth of their gratitude as they vanished into the night. And he pushed outward. He didn't resist the collector. He carried the freed souls within him, their light filling every broken space, every fracture in his being. He had become a vessel not for one shadow, but for many flames. The collector roared. The light seared him, piercing the void beneath his hat, splitting him into fragments of smoke. His claw melted into nothingness, leaving Daniel gasping on the altar stones. For the first time, the collector staggered back. Daniel stood, body trembling, bead clenched in his fist. "You can't take me," he said, voice steady despite his fear. "Because I'm not alone." The forest erupted with whispers, not of despair, but of freedom. The voices of the freed souls filled the air, chanting in a harmony that bent the night itself. Their light gathered behind Daniel, a tidal wave of radiance. The collector shrieked, a sound that cracked branches and split stone. His form dissolved, shadow scattering like ash in a storm. He clawed at the earth, the trees, the very air, but there was nothing left to anchor him. The light surged forward, engulfing him, and then he was gone. The silence that followed was vast, too vast. Daniel collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, body drenched in sweat. The rosary bead rolled from his palm and came to rest against the altar, its glow fading. The forest seemed to breathe again. Crickets chirped. An owl hooted. The wind carried only the scent of pine. Daniel lay back on the damp earth and closed his eyes. He had done it. The cycle was broken. Days passed before they found him. A group of hikers stumbled across the clearing, startled by the ruins of the altar. Daniel was unconscious but alive. Body weakened. Mind shattered from exhaustion. They carried him to the hospital, where he awoke under fluorescent lights, tubes in his arms, machines humming beside him. Doctors called it a miracle. His body bore signs of hypothermia, dehydration, and trauma, but no fatal damage. They asked him what had happened, how he had survived so long in the woods. Daniel said nothing. How could he explain? Who would believe him? Instead, he listened to the world around him. Students laughing in the hall. Nurses chatting by the desk. The sounds of life, ordinary and unremarkable. The sounds of a world untouched by the collector. He smiled faintly, though his chest still ached. Weeks later, Daniel returned to campus. The chapel had been boarded shut, marked unsafe. Rumors swirled off deaths, of disappearances, of strange lights. No one dared speak openly of the forest, though some swore they heard whispers there at night. Daniel knew better. He carried the memories of that night, the faces of the freed, the roar of the collector's undoing. He carried the scar of sacrifice, invisible but permanent. And Yeath also carried doubt. Because sometimes, when the campus was quiet, he felt a shadow at the edge of his vision. A flicker of movement in a reflection. A whisper in the static between radio stations. The collector was gone. But was he truly destroyed? Or had some fragment endured, waiting for another bargain, another desperate soul? Daniel never knew. The answer came years later. Daniel had graduated, left town, built a quiet life. He rarely spoke of the past, burying it under work and routine. He married, raised children, aged. The memories dulled but never vanished. One winter evening, long after the house had gone quiet, Daniel sat by the fire with a worn notebook in his lap. He had begun writing the story, piece by piece, not for himself but for whoever came after. A warning. His hand trembled as he wrote the final line. If you ever hear footsteps in the silence, do not follow. Do not look back. The fire crackled. The room was still. And then 3 slow, deliberate knocks on his door. Daniel froze. His pen slipped from his fingers. The knocks came again. Louder. Closer. And through the glass. Reflected faintly in the darkness outside. He saw it. A wide-brimmed hat.